Okay, we all good to go, Hayley? Thumbs up. Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to those of you who have been to our previous webinar sessions. Thanks for joining us today for what is our fourth webinar in the ADHD series. And this one is entitled Exam Revision for Students with ADHD. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Matt Fenner and my pronouns are he, him, and I'm one of the accessibility advisors representing Uni Access today from the Disability Support Service for students at UWA. Just to start with an acknowledgement of country, I'm joining you personally today from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people on the main UWA campus at Crawley, and the Whadjuk Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Just a little bit of standard housekeeping information. Firstly, just to let you know that you can activate captions for this session by clicking on the More Actions icon, and that's just the three dots at the top of your Teams bar on your screen, and selecting Turn on Live Captions option. Just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available immediately after the session in the Microsoft Teams channel. And then we'll add that eventually in the next few days to our YouTube channel with the other webinar sessions that you can find in there. Please do feel free to use the chat function as we go through the session today. I'll try and sort of summarize the questions and try and encourage them more towards the end of the presentation so we can collate them and do a Q&A toward the end, but happy for conversations to continue throughout the chat as we go through the session today. So to introduce and welcome back Izzy Rosen, who is a Senior Learning Skills Advisor from Study Smarter. Thank you for coming back, Izzy. Izzy's going to discuss the topic today is on the scientific evidence on memory and learning, and hopefully give you some practical strategies to help you retain information for your upcoming exams. So thank you, Izzy, and I'll pass over to you.
Cheers, thanks so much, Matt. I can see a few familiar names from my session right at the beginning of semester, so welcome again, and also some unfamiliar names, some people jumping in for the first time. So my name's Izzy, as Matt said. I work for Study Smarter. If you haven't already chatted to us or accessed our services, we're UWA's Academic Skills Centre, which means we're here to help you with all of those broader academic skills that your tutors, lecturers don't necessarily have the time to work through at length with you. Things like writing essays, lab reports, any assignment structure. We've seen all types. And of course, we're also here to help generally with study skills and in particular exam revision, which has become a bit of a passion project for me. So my background is in psychology. And when I first took this job, loads of students would come to me asking, what's the best way to study for exams? What's actually effective? And my background is actually social psychology. So, you know, as you're probably starting to work out, these tiny subdisciplinary differences can loom large. I hadn't really concerned myself much with cognitive psychology, but I was aware that that there must be some psychological research to speak to this. What are some of the most effective ways to study? And so I took a deep dive into the literature and was really pleased to find this multidisciplinary field called learning science, or the science of learning, which draws on cognitive psychology, which comes up for models with how memory works, neuroscience, tries to peer into the black box, and brought insights from those areas together with education, examining this question: what's the best way for students to encode memories. How do we actually study with the likelihood of being able to successfully call that information to mind later? And of course, trying to bring teachers and students to the table. What's going to work? Are these research questions pertinent to people from the education space? So yeah, there's this fascinating and rich body of literature. Unfortunately, how this applies to students with ADHD is kind of new. Particularly, there's a lot of work looking at children with ADHD, but college, university students, the work is really only just starting to emerge. So I've integrated it to the extent that I can. But yeah, it's really quite new and underdeveloped. So, if you're looking for a area of research to work towards, to jump into, there's some big gaps there. But I just wanted to put that caveat because this science it's so new. So I don't want to give you really specific ways of doing things that aren't necessarily backed up with evidence. But I found this. I came across a particular framework that I personally found quite fascinating, and it was talking about the differences in motivation between students or people who are neurotypical and people with ADHD, and they find that that what might motivate someone who's neurotypical is a bit different. So they'll probably be motivated by things like the importance of the tasks, the rewards of the task, and at the other end of that, the consequences for not doing it. But they find that there's, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this, and I'd love to hear if this fits with your own experience and what you know, that I should say as well, particularly it's coming in as we start to challenge the idea of ADHD as a deficit of attention. It's more that attention can be engaged really successfully as long as certain criteria are met. So if the task, if what you're doing is personally relevant or interesting to you, if it feels challenging, and together with that, if it feels novel or exciting, it's much more likely that you'll be able to direct your attention to it. And they're starting to think, I'm sure you're aware, that dopamine is implicated. So the hormone that gives us that surge of pleasure when we get some kind of unexpected reward, that research is coming to light, showing that in the brains of people with ADHD, there's lower activity in the reward center of your brain. So you need something to be especially interesting or novel to get that same payoff. So you don't necessarily get that same reward that neurotypical people do just from getting a task done. The other one is urgency. And when it comes to exam study, this is the one we're trying to avoid being motivated by, because as you know, that motivation that can come from something being right down at the last minute, the reward you feel when you actually pull it off, when you get it done, that's not particularly sustainable, and it's a pretty stressful way of doing things. So I want to instead frame some of these strategies I'll talk about in how we can make them more interesting, challenging, or novel for you, and try to nudge ourselves away from pushing that study to the last minute to make it urgent. But of course, each of your own experiences are different. I don't want to tell you how your brain works and what your experience is. There's the research on one hand, and there's how it works for you in practice. But I wanted to just throw out this question. How would you normally go about studying for tests or exams? I think as I'm speaking to all sorts of different students, what I find is that you don't necessarily get explicitly taught how to do this, what the most effective ways are. So I'd love to hear, how would you normally go about this? Just throw any answer you like into the chat. What would your strategies be? What do you find works? Or if it's been a long time, what are you thinking of doing? Cram. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, cramming. If you are cramming, what would you what would you actually do within the study session? Like what, rather than, I'd love to hear how you schedule or organize your time too, but when you sit down to study, what do you do? What's effective? So yeah, it can feel like an all or nothing. 20-minute timer every day to revise over semester. That's fantastic. Flashcards and revising notes. Try to do practice questions, which are fantastic, and I'll talk about why, but it usually is at the last minute. Yeah. Write it out on a whiteboard. I used to make palm cards, but that was a long time ago. Now I cram and try to make answer templates that I can copy and paste in the exam. Yeah, okay. Yep. Okay, any other ideas? So we've got a few flashcards practice questions coming up, so kind of testing yourself. Anything else? Anything obvious? Like, how do we study? What do you do? Okay. Honestly, I usually run out of time. Yeah, that's really really common to stay on top of assignments. I know it can feel like that, just hard enough to keep up with assignments during semester. But in an ideal world, sometimes I'll type up my lecture notes and then use that to discuss it with someone. That's great. Or have them test me on that content. That's excellent too. Okay. Those are two really effective strategies, which I'll also talk about why. Oh, that's great. Have a look at the unit outline. Yeah. So stepping back and thinking strategically, what am I likely to be examined on? To understand what they want to test me. Yeah. What does this unit think that it's teaching me? What's examinable? So good to so worthwhile to go back to that unit outline and create an outline of what the key content actually is, what the learning outcomes are. Learning outcomes at the top of every single unit outline. Sometimes they're written in those kind of edge-of-speak language we think of, but still useful. Okay, thanks so much, guys. Now, this didn't actually come up, but what we know is loads of students report doing this, that they'll have written some notes from their lectures, or they'll have a textbook in front of them, and they spend a lot of their study time reading through those notes or highlighting. Now, this is only going to get you so far. They're some of the least effective ways of studying, but thankfully that didn't actually come up. A lot of you guys are talking about quite effective strategies, which is great, really interesting. But perhaps today I can give you some of the why in that sense, to know the principle underneath why perhaps you've nudged yourself towards these strategies and found them to be more useful. So I'm going to talk through 3 strategies, all drawn from the learning sciences. Some of them, as I say, starting to be tested out in students with ADHD, but it's a very new body of work. So they are spacing your study, essentially the opposite of cramming. Number 2 is something that cognitive psychologists call elaboration. Involves a couple different strategies within that, but essentially the idea that when we go broad, when we go out and think of something with loads of details, it actually helps us encode it better and makes it more likely we'll remember it later. And then finally, number 3, deceptively simple. So pleased to see so many of you engaging those strategies already in your study. But it's something we call retrieval practice, where you practice recalling information, not just in a couple of days before. This is something you can do right away at the beginning of semester, in the few weeks leading up to exams, testing yourself. And as I said, I'll talk through why each of these are so effective. Okay. So spacing, your study, as a few of you are highlighting that urgency, that sense of urgency can lead to cramming. The pressures on you during semester mean that it's tempting to put off exam study right until the end of semester, the study break. And I know we're getting close to there, but this principle can still be effective for you. So it's about the choices we make when it comes to scheduling our study time. You have a choice between do you concentrate your study in one long block of time, that concentrated practice, or do you split it up into shorter blocks over the week? And what this research shows, this finding is as old as time, well, at least comes from 1885 and has since been tested in multiple contexts. And this one has some work in students with ADHD and diverse types of learners. That when you distribute your practice, when you space it out into those shorter blocks of time, you'll learn it more efficiently, more effectively. So I'll just talk you through why this is the case, because I hope this can help convince you that even if it feels hard, that the sooner you start studying, if you space out your study, it's actually going to save you time. You're not going to be depleting down all those resources. So as I said, German psychologist called Ebbinghaus, 1885, published a book called On Memory. He ran a series of experiments on himself. He tried to memorize these long word lists. We don't think of that as very scientific these days, but this finding has since been replicated in, as I say, in all sorts of different settings. And what it shows is that when we first learn something, we forget it pretty quickly. So if you've had that experience, that's really normal. If you go into a lecture and a few days later you can't remember that much of it, that's perfectly normal. You don't need to stress about that. When we're next exposed to the information, that curve is not quite as steep, and so on, so on. So this probably fits with your experience too. We know that repetition helps us learn something, but the spacing here is so important, and how we organize our time, because if you think back to that decision, let's just say it's kind of simpler to think about it in terms of a test that you've got coming up. If you've got it scheduled in a week and you've got 5 hours of study time, say, you could allocate 5 hours in one day to learning that material, but that would still count as that first learn. So you spend that full 5 hours, you forget it a few days later. Now that works okay if the test is the next day, but say it's a week later. If you take that same 5 hours and split it out into smaller blocks over time, you can see how you'll recall much more of that information by the time it comes to the test a week later. And this, of course, works much better when we think about the sheer amount of information that you're asked to learn at a university level for exams. It's super stressful. There's a lot to learn. So it's not just that cramming is stressful because you're wondering if you're going to get through all of it. It's also that you're doubling up on that learning. So if you spread out your revision, start studying for exams right now, you're not going to forget what you're studying by the time exams come around. You'll actually have encoded it better. So maybe if we can think about how can you create that feeling of urgency. I'm sure you guys have lots of strategies that you try when you've got a deadline that's a few weeks away and you're not necessarily feeling that urgency. Try those strategies you normally use in order to encourage those short, frequent sessions over a longer time period. So 5 hours distributed over 1 week is better than 5 hours in one block. This, for a lot of students as well, makes it feel more achievable because it's easier to sit down for an hour or 45 minutes to study than 5 hours. But the key here is this is really essential that you keep revisiting the same information. So it only works to the extent that you return to the same information. So you want to organize your time so that you're reviewing new and old concepts every day or every couple of days. So, you know, I'm telling you the obvious, but definitely make a study plan, fill in your exam dates and times and work backwards. So important to block out time for all those other commitments. It's particularly important to hold on to your self-care routines, even add in more as it approaches exams, because it's just a stressful time. There's no way around that, but you can reduce those feelings of stress. And so you're organizing a time so you're returning to new and old, returning to old concepts, learning new concepts every day. And then you can also apply those principles. So set specific tasks to do, so you know exactly what you're doing when you sit down from 10 to 10:45. You know you're going to practice, do a practice quiz on chapters 3 and 4 for anatomy and human bio. At 1 to 2, we'll go for a walk. Then you'll recreate diagrams from memory, call your friend for a chat, you know, so know what you're doing in the different blocks of time. Okay, I know I'm kind of racing through this, so please throw out any questions that you have. Or, you know, oh, are the slides not changing? Hope you're just saying that you're not seeing me flip through the slides. Mine are changing. Oh, thanks, Liz. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can see those as they're coming through.
Oh, okay. Not sure what's going on there. Okay, there will be a recording available of this, so I'm not sure. Maybe your screen's freezing. Sorry about that. Okay. So number 2, apply, ask, explain, and connect. This idea of elaboration. A lot of students I speak to, because, as we've discussed, the sheer amount of content that they're asked to learn for exams, there's a tendency to want to narrow that information down to its simplest form, and then do a bit of rote learning. So repeat it loads of times until you can remember it. But what this body of work suggests is that actually by spending that bit of extra time expanding, elaborating, you'll understand what you're learning better, but also you'll be more likely to remember it, even if you're tested on it in a simpler way. So more details can be better to a limit. So the key here is that you're making what we call semantic connections, which is just a fancy way of saying we're attending to the material in a meaningful way. We're thinking about the meaning, not just repeating it. And you can do it by applying it to what you already know, thinking of concrete examples. It's really useful if you monitor your evolving understanding by asking yourself lots of questions, thinking about the how and why of things work. And it's even better when you take charge of this, so you generate explanations, make links. Essentially what underpins this is the idea that if we have multiple access points, many different ways of entering or accessing a particular idea, there's a higher likelihood we'll call that to mind later, if that makes sense. So let me explain. I'm gonna have to skip past this discussion. So so the way our memories tend to be structured, it's not in these like discrete definitions. We don't have an individual entry for punishment or police or crime. We tend to organize our knowledge in what we call schemas. So these structures that provide a framework for future understanding. So if I say the word justice, it calls to mind this complex web of interconnected ideas. So so this idea of elaboration, we want to go with the grain of that. When you're learning something, try to incorporate it into that rich existing body of knowledge rather than leaning towards that sort of repetitive type learning. one of the ways we can do this is by using concrete examples and stories. So often what we're asked to learn at university is very complex and abstract. That's the nature of what we're doing here. We're grappling with these big ideas, but we know that people are much better at remembering individual stories, ideas when they're given context. And I should say as well, this idea of elaboration, this is a great way for you to engage that. If we think back to the idea of interest, challenge, and novelty, this is a chance for you to get interested in what you're studying. So I'll just run through an example of that, of how we can use these examples and stories. No matter what you're learning, I've just chosen a theory. It comes from psychology, linguistics. This is something interesting to me, but we'll often be presented information like this. We'll read a brief definition of a theory in a textbook. Perhaps your lecturer just presents it straight like this. So this theory goes, the critical period hypothesis states that the first few years of life constitute the time during which language develops readily, and after which, sometime between age 5 and puberty, language acquisition is much more difficult and ultimately less successful. Okay, this is actually quite a controversial theory. We tend to think of it more in sensitive periods, but it really only applies to language acquisition. But anyway, so you could read through this loads of times until you kind of remember it, or you could apply it to something more concrete. So if we think of Tarzan, created by Edgar Rice Burroughs, later adapted by Disney, of course, tells the story of a British lord and lady marooned on the Atlantic coast of Africa with their son Tarzan. Tarzan's parents sadly perish. He's raised by great apes. So given that critical period hypothesis, what are the chances when Jane encounters him in the jungle that he would be able to acquire language? What do you guys think? What do you all think? Unlikely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Disney lied to us there. Yeah. So if we hold this to be true, perhaps he'd be able to acquire a couple of words, but not those sort of complex grammatical structures. So you see how when we apply it to an example, it can become a bit more interesting and engaging, particularly if you use more accurate and relevant examples. This area is fascinating, but notoriously difficult to study. Of course, it's unethical to randomly allocate children to not be exposed to language and see what happens. We tend to try to study it using case studies. So a couple of famous ones I'll talk about. Jeannie from the 1970s, she met those conditions for the case study to study what happens when when a child is not exposed to human language. Very tragically, she was locked up, faced abuse, significant neglect at the hands of her parents, was discovered by the authorities about age 11, brought in for testing of what we know of her. She chose to remain anonymous later in life, good for her, but she was really sadly unable to acquire language in those more complex grammatical ways that we think of. So you can see I'm spending a little bit of extra time to draw in some sort of example, but what I'm doing here will make it much more likely you'll understand and remember the theory later. You'll be likelier to feel engaged, feel motivated. If this is interesting to you, it depends. It's so fascinating to me, but it perhaps makes it a bit likelier when you draw in those relevant examples to link it to a theory that perhaps feels a bit more dry. So spend that extra time, go out, expand, link it to the concrete where you can. That the ADHD tendency to go down the rabbit hole, several students have said this to me, harness that. So you don't want to go down too far, but more details can be great. It can help you create those richer, more complex memories, which will allow you to call it to mind better later. So find examples in your lectures and readings, find your own. The key here is that you're working out how the example links to the concept. Okay, I'm going to skip just to the final strategy. There's a bunch of other ways we can elaborate on what we're learning, but I want to, just because of time, skip to this final strategy, retrieval practice. So when we're studying, often we can feel quite focused on trying to get information into our heads, sort of try to cram it all in. What retrieval practice would suggest is that if we actually try to fish it out, if we retrieve it and call it to mind, something we've learned before, heard before, that's actually a really fast and powerful way of learning. So we all know that retrieval is required in an exam setting to test what someone has learned, right? That's, unless it's an open book exam, that's what we tend to do in exams. But what's less explicitly known, I think, is that process itself is essential for learning. Every single mind we retrieve, we call something to mind, is laying down a stronger memory. That's compared to the comparable amount of time spent reading through the learning materials. So this is why it's sometimes called the testing effect. If you teach students something and test them on it a couple of days later, or just give them a chance to read over the lecture notes, in that group who are tested will be more likely to learn it when you test all of those students again several days later. The ones who were simply tested, so they weren't able to look at the information again, they just had to practice retrieving it, they learn faster. So this strategy has been studied in students with ADHD. A couple of papers out, as I said, not the extensive body of work you'd hope for, but it's really promising. So what it shows is that students with ADHD, on one hand, report using retrieval less than neurotypical students. That doesn't seem to be the case with this particular group, but of course we're working on averages here. And when they're encouraged to use retrieval, they get just as much benefit from it compared to a group of neurotypical students. So you really can't go wrong using this. And it's something that cognitive psychologists describe as a desirable difficulty. So a lot of students actually stay away from testing themselves. Two reasons. It shows us what we don't know. So when you do a practice test, you might find you get half of it wrong. That can make you feel more anxious in the lead up to exams. That's actually a really important process. It's showing you what you don't know and what you still need to learn. And just the very fact, even that 50% of material you're able to call to mind, that in and of itself, that very act of calling it to mind, created a neural pathway. So we're aiming for a struggle, that feeling at a quiz night, when you know the answer to something, you're kind of struggling to call it to mind and it sort of pops into your head. That's actually the feeling we're aiming for. But we want to do it multiple times. So you can see it fits in with that spaced repetition I was talking about at the beginning of the workshop. So if you think the first time you call a bit of information to mind that you're trying to learn, it's like walking through a field of grass for the first time. It lays down a very faint trace. By the time we've called it to mind several times, it's like walking that path again multiple times. It's going to then lay down a really well-worn pathway when it comes to the exam. That process of retrieval will feel much more rapid and automatic. But the key here is retrieving the same information more than once. And need to leave time in between your retrieval attempts. So don't just do it all in one day or straight after the lecture. Wait till the next day. Wait a couple of days because you actually want to forget a little bit struggle to retrieve. That's what's creating that really strong memory. So this is where all of those strategies you guys said right at the beginning are fantastic. Flashcards. If you stop using them, pull it out again to the extent that they allow you to test yourself. Sometimes they're not quite fit for purpose because you might have a complex essay style exam. Try to design them so they test that, you know, what are the strengths and weaknesses of a particular theory, rather than just memorizing key terms. For example, you might need to memorize key terms. If you're studying anatomy and human biology, there is a certain amount you just need to know. Flashcards are really great for that. Someone said they talk to others about what they're learning and ask somebody else to test them. Fantastic. This is, again, thought to be so useful to the extent that it engages retrieval. When you're explaining it to somebody else without your notes, you're engaging retrieval. You're calling to mind what you've learned. You can just take a blank piece of paper, that little picture of Calvin there, what we call a brain dump, start to write down everything that you know from memory, check back with your notes. Practice tests are fantastic if you can access past exam papers. You guys know how to do that. You just type the unit code into one search. Not available for plenty of units, so that's unfortunate. But find questions where you can, end of chapters in textbooks. You can write your own. Some students I speak to will go through their notes and construct them separately as a series of questions. So they've got that reference point to check back to, but a series of prompts to help them engage retrieval. And the key here is that you keep trying. It's a desirable difficulty. Retrieval practice is way harder than reading through your notes. Something that can push students away from doing it. But even if you only recall a little bit, so say you're trying a brain dump, you've just taken out a blank piece of paper, you're trying to see what you can remember about a particular theory, you might recall one thing. That's fantastic. Call that successful. Go back to your notes, think about those concrete examples, try to elaborate, connect it to what you already know, test yourself again the next day. You might find that you recall a little bit more. So it does take that building up. It's challenging. Don't let that deter you. That means it's working. So you can see how highlighting your notes, reading through them, it can give you that feeling of fluency. It starts to become familiar, but that's actually engaging something, a slightly different memory process, recognition. So you're able to recognize that you've come across this information, but it's not engaging retrieval, which is a lot harder, but a lot more powerful. So I think I've hammered this home enough. Really promising to see some work that this is just effective in students with ADHD. Try to incorporate this into all of your study sessions. Okay, guys, so those are the 3 strategies. There's so much more I could talk about. Only 10 minutes over time. I just wanted to say really briefly, you can come and chat to Study Smarter about anything I've talked about today, or some of those more pragmatic aspects of exams, how to work out what you actually need to study to decode the unit outline. Any assignments you're still working on, we're here to help. So you can see us in person at our drop-ins. Those are Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 to 12 in the Reed Library. Still, we'll run them through study break. You can also book an online appointment. Just go to our website, click this little book now button. You can speak to me or one of my colleagues for 30 minutes one-on-one about any aspect of your study. So don't be shy, please come see us. We're here to help. If you, as I said right at the beginning, if you don't feel confident in how you should be studying, you're not alone. Loads of students feel that way. It's not something we necessarily get explicitly taught how to do. Yeah, we're here to help. Okay, so I think we've got a little bit of time left. I think we had a couple of questions, but I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys have.
Thank you, Izzy. Izzy, where were you 15, 20 years or so ago? Very practical, helpful tips that I very much would have benefited from. I'm sure hopefully others will find the same. I'll keep an eye on the chat. I didn't actually note, forgive me, I may have skipped over some. I didn't actually note any questions per se, but please feel free for the next few minutes, anybody who has any questions whilst we've got Izzy with us for a few minutes or so. Izzy, just to from a personal perspective, I'm often use the phrase to my peers around having context and kind of the storytelling aspect and the, I guess you would call it, the semantic memorization. I love that idea in terms of building blocks, giving it some context and meaning to kind of help with that recall. I think that's a really interesting concept, and we often, I personally, and I think my peers as well, talk about, again, from a very basic level, it's about sort of chunking and building sort of smaller goal setting and that kind of thing, which I kind of feel personally feeds into that as well. So yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, we've got just wondering, so this is from Eliza. Hi, Izzy, just wondering if you have any tips on how to get started once I get going. I'm okay.
So I don't know if you're in the session right at the beginning of semester, but that should be available online. That was more around the practicalities of how you might like to schedule your time and get going. There's no silver bullet. We know it's something really tricky for students with ADHD. And I guess a lot of what I discussed in that session was that like you're probably aware of the some of the strategies, but it's actually putting that into motion when it comes down to at the point of performance, actually doing it. So I chat through some of the ways you can try to nudge yourself to that. Yeah, so I'd check that out, but more than happy to chat more. If you want to book an online consult, sure, come see us or drop in. Okay, for taking notes on lectures, is it generally better to type or handwrite your notes? So there's a big paper showing that students learn better when handwriting, but I think it's complicated by a lot of personal factors, because I suppose and actually they find that in the absence of, so one of the reasons when you sit there in your lecture with your laptop, it's really easy to get distracted. So to check social media or look at other things on your laptop. So even without that, even if you turn your internet off and just have a Word document, it seems to be the case that when people write notes out, they encode it better. But it's so handy to have that those typed up notes. So just weigh it up. It's also a personal decision there. Yeah, there's always the research on one hand and kind of what works for you. Does that help? What do you find helpful, Ben? Okay, any other questions for the minute? Yeah, exactly. So you've been switching it up. You find handwriting better for memory. It just takes longer. Yeah, I think a bit of both. Also, we're kind of out of practice with handwriting. It's this if you do have an in-person exam and suddenly you have to write a whole essay in hand, and all you've been doing all semester is typing. That can be a tricky transition for lots of students. So another benefit there is sometimes handwriting.
Izzy, as we come to the end of the session, if there's any questions that come through beyond this session, are you happy if we field them to you or forward them on
yes,
to me?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So so you're welcome to email me. I can I'll just pop my email address into the chat.
Right, thank you, Izzy.
The other thing is I tend to be at drop-in on Thursdays. So this so the session that runs Tuesdays and Thursdays 10 to 12. I get to be scheduled on Thursdays. Sometimes I'm there Tuesdays as well, but come say hi. I'm more than happy to chat about some of this as well. Just flag it with the student later that you want to chat about some of this stuff more specifically. So so you sort of greet the student leader, they'll enter your details in, and then they'll allocate you to see me or one of my colleagues. So it's okay if you just say, do you mind if I talk to Izzy? Okay.
Izzy, thank you.
Welcome.
We probably ought to start to wrap up there, conscious people might have a 2 o'clock classes to get to. So thank you, Izzy, very fruitful again, as with the first session. As mentioned, you're welcome to keep putting through the questions in the chat channel. Also, Izzy and Hayley, my colleague, reminded me that I think it was born out of the first session. There was a peer-led student chat channel that came out of that first webinar. So if anybody isn't involved in that chat and would like to be, if you could maybe just flag that in the meeting chat here today, and we'll collate those names and put those forward to the owner of that chat. I think it's a really good way of opening up the conversation more broadly to other people with ADHD and other students who are maybe trying to find ways and strategies of doing things a little bit more productively or easier. So yeah, please put that in the chat and we'll get you included in that channel. The YouTube channel, I think I mentioned at the start, the session today, as with all of the other sessions, will be uploaded to the Uni Access YouTube channel. So within a couple of days, you'll be able to find this fourth and final session on there. And finally from me, Izzy, thank you very much again for your input, and thank you to everybody for your contributions. I hope you find some of those strategies useful, and we hope to see all of you or many of you again in future. So thank you.
Yes.
Close the meeting there. Thank you.